Security protocols at Milan's Malpensa airport recorded nothing unusual on the afternoon of November 14th. That day, a 40-year-old Mafia boss moved through the international terminal completely unnoticed. He expected crowds, flight delays, tourists struggling with luggage. Instead, he noticed a 20-year-old woman in an athletic jersey, walking with the rigid precision of someone being controlled. Her neck was locked in a white cervical collar. Her eyes swept the terminal not with curiosity but with calculation. As she passed him, she didn't stop. She didn't speak. She only adjusted her bag for half a second, and in that motion, slipped something into his coat pocket. No one else saw it, but he did. And in that instant, he knew her situation was far more dangerous than it appeared. Zarevyn Kaelith didn't believe in accidents. He believed in patterns, in the weight of silence, in the space between glances where intentions revealed themselves and deceptions crumbled. At 40, he had learned to read danger the way other men read financial reports, quickly, precisely, without emotion clouding analysis. The terminal at Malpensa hummed with its usual rhythm. Business travelers checking boarding passes, families navigating security lines, announcements echoing in Italian and English through spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Zarevyn moved through it all like a shadow. Tailored dark suit, understated watch, no visible jewelry, nothing that advertised wealth or the kind of influence that could make entire neighborhoods go silent with a single phone call. To everyone around him, he was just another traveler, a consultant, maybe, on someone heading home after meetings that held no particular significance. No one looked twice. That was precisely how he preferred it. He'd been in Milan for 2 days, business that required his physical presence, the kind of negotiations where encrypted communications and intermediaries weren't sufficient, where men needed to sit across from each other and understand exactly what cooperation meant and what betrayal would cost. Now he was heading back to Palermo, back to the carefully constructed life he maintained there, back to the organization that answered only to him. He sat in the gate area near Terminal 1, phone in hand, but his attention elsewhere. His gaze wandered across faces, movements, the underlying rhythm of the crowd. Old habits. Even here, outside his territory, he couldn't stop himself from observing, and from cataloging anomalies that probably didn't exist, from reading environments the way some people read novels. That's when he saw her. A young woman, early 20s perhaps, pale complexion, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that looked functional rather than styled. She wore dark athletic pants and a numbered jersey, the kind athletes wear, but hers was loose, hanging on her frame in a way that suggested recent weight loss, and around her neck, a rigid white cervical collar that immediately drew the eye. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned that sudden movements attracted attention she couldn't afford. The woman walked past the seating area, her path taking her within 2 meters of where he sat. She didn't look at him directly, didn't make eye contact. But as she passed, adjusting the strap of her bag with her right hand, her left hand moved with deliberate precision. The motion was so brief, so controlled, that only someone watching for exactly that kind of gesture would have caught it. Something light touched his coat pocket. Paper. Folded small. She continued walking without breaking stride, without hesitation, moving toward the gate area with the mechanical compliance of someone who knew she was being watched. Zarevyn sat perfectly still. His hand didn't move toward the pocket. His expression didn't change. But every instinct he'd honed over 2 decades in his profession had just activated. This wasn't random. This was calculated. This was someone making a desperate gamble on his ability to recognize what others would miss. He watched her settle into a seat 3 rows from the gate. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the departure screen. But there was something in the way she held herself, the controlled breathing, the absolute stillness that spoke of someone exerting tremendous effort to appear calm. Zarevyn studied her face. Even from this distance, he could see details that told a story. A fading bruise along her jawline, barely visible beneath carefully applied concealer. The cervical collar was medical grade, but the way she wore it suggested familiarity, not a recent prescription. Her hands, though folded calmly, showed fingernails bitten down to the quick on her right hand, while the left remained untouched. Asymmetrical nervous habit. Someone who'd been forbidden from displaying obvious anxiety. After a full minute, when the crowd had shifted enough to provide momentary cover, Zarevyn reached into his coat pocket with the casual motion of someone checking for their boarding pass. His fingers found the paper immediately. Small, folded tight, the edges sharp against his palm. He stood, picking up his leather bag with unhurried efficiency, and walked toward the restrooms. Inside, he moved to the farthest stall, locked the door, and unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, despite the obvious urgency. Controlled, precise. Hotel Meridiana. Room 314. 3 men rotating shifts. Transport tomorrow evening, 11 p.m. 5 women total. Name: Marco Salvetti. And below that, one line that changed everything. I chose you because you see things others don't. Zarevyn read it twice. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the note before refolding it and slipping it into his inner jacket pocket. His mind was already calculating timelines, resources, risk assessment. This wasn't his city. This wasn't his jurisdiction. This wasn't his problem. But someone had just made it his choice. He emerged from the restroom and returned to his seat, every movement deliberate, unremarkable. The woman was still seated, still perfectly still. Zarevyn picked up his phone and composed a single text message in Italian, using terminology that would mean nothing to anyone intercepting it, but everything to the man receiving it. Need you in Milan. Tonight. Bring the usual tools. Situation requires immediate assessment. He hit send. Then he sat back and waited for boarding to begin, on his eyes never leaving the young woman who'd just gambled her life on a 3-second pass and the instincts of a man she'd never met. She'd chosen him specifically. That meant she'd been watching, evaluating, making strategic decisions under conditions that would break most people. That level of operational thinking didn't come from panic. It came from someone who'd been planning her escape with the same precision he used to plan his business. And that, more than anything else, told Zarevyn Kaelith exactly what kind of situation he'd just been pulled into. Subscribe if you want more stories where one moment changes everything. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Zarevyn Kaelith doesn't exist in official databases. The passport in his jacket pocket identifies him as Matteo Rossini, business consultant from Palermo, to specializing in supply chain optimization for Mediterranean shipping firms. The legend is immaculate. 15 years of carefully constructed documentation supporting it. Tax returns filed annually, showing modest but steady income. Utility bills for a 2-bedroom apartment in Palermo's Calza district, a leased Alfa Romeo registered in his name. Bank statements reflecting the life of a professional who travels frequently but lives within reasonable means. The man carrying Rossini's passport commands a criminal empire built on information, strategic positioning, and the kind of reputation that makes entire operations dissolve before they fully materialize. At 40, he's outlasted competitors, rivals, and ambitious subordinates by following one absolute rule: never let emotion dictate action. Anger is liability. Sentimentality is weakness, while decisions are made through cold assessment of cost, benefit, and long-term positioning. Nothing else. Today's meeting in Milan had been routine. Associates from Turin required face-to-face confirmation on a shipping arrangement that would move through Genoa over the next quarter. The kind of conversation that couldn't happen over encrypted channels because trust, real trust, still required men to look each other in the eye and understand what failure would cost. 3 hours. Handshakes. Espresso in a private room above a trattoria that had operated in the same family for 4 generations, and asked no questions about who met in their upstairs dining room. The note in his pocket had changed everything. The woman who'd passed it to him, athletic jersey, cervical collar, no controlled terror barely concealed, had demonstrated something rare: strategic thinking under impossible pressure. She hadn't begged or pleaded. She'd provided intelligence, coordinates, timeline, target identification, and she'd chosen him. That calculation impressed him more than he cared to admit. In a terminal filled with hundreds of travelers, she'd identified someone with the capacity and potentially the willingness to act. She'd read him as accurately as he'd read her. The note provided critical details: Hotel Meridiana, room 314, 3 handlers rotating shifts, transport scheduled for 2,300 hours the following evening. 5 women total. The coordinator's name, Marco Salvetti. And that final line, "I chose you because you see things others don't," revealed a mind that remained operational even under extreme duress. But Zarevyn's professional instinct told him to walk away. This wasn't his territory. These weren't his people. Getting involved risked exposure, complications, entanglements that could follow him back to Sicily. But the quality of her thinking had earned his attention. And once Zarevyn Kaelith's attention was engaged, detachment became significantly more difficult. He'd already sent for Luca. The machinery was already in motion. Luca's response had arrived within 90 seconds. Understood. Landing by 2100. Zarevyn studied the photograph of the note on his phone, analyzing what it revealed beyond its literal content. The handwriting was steady despite what must have been written under conditions of absolute terror. Each letter formed with deliberate control. Now, this wasn't someone breaking under pressure. This was someone who'd maintained operational discipline when most people would have dissolved into panic. She'd been gathering intelligence, memorizing schedules, counting captors, identifying the coordinator by name. She'd documented not just her own situation, but the scope of the operation. 5 women. That meant she'd been thinking beyond her own survival, considering the others trapped with her. And then she'd executed a dead-drop pass in a crowded terminal while under surveillance. The level of courage and precision that required was extraordinary. Zarevyn's entire operational philosophy was built on strategic detachment. He didn't involve himself in matters outside his organization's interests. He didn't risk exposure for situations that held no strategic value. His empire was built on calculated decisions, with emotion surgically removed from the equation. But the note had changed the calculation, not because of what it said, but because of what it demonstrated. She hadn't appealed to sympathy or morality. She'd provided actionable intelligence and executed a tactical operation under conditions that would have broken trained professionals. She'd identified him specifically, not randomly, but through assessment and analysis, and made a calculated gamble that he would recognize the quality of her thinking. That level of operational competence under duress wasn't desperation meeting luck. It was planning meeting opportunity. The timeline was clear. Transport departed at 2,300 hours the following evening. That gave him approximately 30 hours to assess, plan, and execute. Tight, but manageable with the right resources. Zarevyn told himself he was just gathering preliminary information, making an assessment, determining whether the situation warranted further attention. But Luca was already en route with equipment and personnel. The commitment had already been made. Luca arrived at 20:04 hours, precisely 13 minutes ahead of schedule. He carried a leather messenger bag that could belong to any traveling professional, and was accompanied by 2 men Zarevyn had worked with before, Dante and Alessio, Both former military intelligence, both capable of extended surveillance without drawing attention. They met in the parking structure of a commercial building 2 kilometers from Hotel Meridiana. So speaking in the abbreviated shorthand of people who'd operated together long enough that full sentences were unnecessary. Equipment? Zarevyn asked. Luca opened the bag. Telephoto lens, parabolic microphone, 3 clean phones with prepaid SIMs, tablet loaded with facial recognition software and database access that cost more than most people earned in a year. The location? Industrial district, budget hotel, transient workers, monthly rentals, management that takes cash and asks nothing. Dante pulled up a satellite image on the tablet. Room 314, 3rd floor, interior corridor, 2 stairwells, 1 elevator. Limited exits. Perfect for containment, terrible for escape. They established observation from a vacant office building across the street, the kind of half-empty commercial space that dotted Milan's industrial zones. Businesses relocated or failed, leaving behind shells that served purposes their original architects never imagined. Through the telephoto lens, Zarevyn could see Hotel Meridiana's 3rd floor windows. Room 314's curtains remained drawn, but gaps at the edges revealed movement, shapes, the rhythm of occupation. Over the next 6 hours, they documented everything. 3 men rotating in 8-hour shifts, 1 inside the room, 2 in a vehicle parked in the hotel lot, switching positions with military precision at 0600, 1400, and 2200. Food delivered twice daily by the same delivery service, always received at the door, never allowing the delivery person to see inside. The curtains never opened. The room's occupants never left. At 1900 hours, as evening light faded across Milan's skyline, Zarevyn caught movement through the gap in the curtains. A figure passed the window, female, slender, wearing the same athletic jersey from the airport. Even through the telephoto lens, even from this distance, he recognized the body language, the careful movements, the controlled terror of someone who'd learned that survival meant absolute compliance. Marco Salvetti, Luca said, reviewing information on the tablet. Age 43. Operates Salvetti Servizi di Pulizia, industrial cleaning services. Legitimate business, government contracts, corporate clients. Also runs a parallel operation moving women from Italy to Romania, Slovakia, sometimes further east. Dante pulled up financial records that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside law enforcement or intelligence services. He's good at maintaining separation. The cleaning business is clean. Taxes paid, employees documented, everything legitimate. But he's got connections to a logistics company in Turin that's been flagged for potential sanctions violations. Digital communications use encrypted platforms, but he's sloppy about operational security on personal devices. Vulnerabilities? Zarevyn asked. His daughter attends university in Bologna. Wife works for the regional health department. Mother in a church-run care facility. He's built a life that depends on maintaining legitimacy. Exposure would collapse everything, not just the trafficking operation, but his business, his family's reputation, his position in the community. Zarevyn studied the hotel through the lens, watching shadows move behind curtains, cataloging patterns that would matter when timing became critical. Salvetti's operation was sophisticated because it hid behind legitimate infrastructure. But sophisticated systems had sophisticated vulnerabilities. And men who built lives on dual identities had the most to lose when those identities collided. Timeline, Luca asked. Transport leaves tomorrow, 2300 hours. We move at 0600, 18 hours to dismantle this before they disappear. By midnight, Zarevyn's network had confirmed what the note already told him. Time was running out. Alessio's contact in Milan's logistics sector identified the transport, a refrigerated cargo container, scheduled for the 2300 departure to Bucharest via rail freight. The container belonged to a produce distribution company that moved legitimate agricultural products across the EU, so its interior modified with hidden compartments, sophisticated enough to pass customs inspection. The route had been operational for 3 years, moving an estimated 40 women during that time, without a single interdiction. Once the women crossed into Romania, they would disappear into a system designed to make people vanish. No documents, no identity, no trail that law enforcement could follow, even if someone reported them missing, which no one would, because they'd been isolated so completely that their absence wouldn't register anywhere that mattered. Luca spread the intelligence across the tablet screen, building a network diagram that revealed the operation's architecture. Salvetti coordinated logistics, securing locations, managing handlers, arranging transport. But he answered to someone in Turin who controlled the financial infrastructure, moving payments through a series of shell companies registered in jurisdictions that ask no questions. That person reported to a syndicate with connections spanning Italy, Austria, Romania, and Ukraine. It's sophisticated because it doesn't rely on violence, Zarevyn observed, studying the diagram. They use fear and bureaucratic complexity. Confiscate documents, isolate victims from anyone who might help, move them through legitimate infrastructure that makes interdiction nearly impossible. Which means the entire operation depends on maintaining the appearance of legitimacy, Dante said. The cleaning company is Salvetti's shield. Remove that, and everything collapses. Zarevyn pulled up Salvetti's business profile. Well, the man had spent years building reputation capital, contracts with international corporations requiring background checks, government facilities with security clearances, hotel chains conducting annual vendor audits. All of it dependent on appearing completely legitimate. His vulnerability isn't physical, Zarevyn said. It's reputational. He's built 2 lives separated by careful compartmentalization. But that separation is maintained through secrecy, not structure. Expose the connection, and both lives collapse simultaneously. He turned to his associates. What he proposed required precision, not violence. No confrontation that would expose his presence in Milan or create complications that would follow him back to Sicily. Just information, delivered at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right person, with exactly the right leverage. We move at 600. Salvetti receives a phone call that explains his new reality. By noon, he releases all 5 women and provides documentation. By evening, his Milan operation ceases to exist. And by the time the transport leaves at 2300, it leaves empty. And if he refuses? Luca asked. Zarevyn's expression didn't change. Then every corporation, government agency, and business partner he works with receives comprehensive documentation of his secondary operation. His business collapses, his family's reputation disintegrates, and Interpol receives everything we have. He'll cooperate because the alternative is total destruction. 18 hours until transport. 18 hours to dismantle a network that had operated invisibly for 3 years. Time to move. At 06:15 hours, Marco Salvetti's personal phone rang. He was in his kitchen in the Milan suburbs, preparing espresso before his wife woke, already thinking about the logistics for tonight's transport. The number on the screen showed no caller ID, which should have been his first warning. He answered anyway. Buongiorno, Marco. The voice was calm, measured, speaking Italian with a Sicilian accent that carried something Marco couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not threat. Just absolute certainty. Who is this? Someone who knows about Hotel Meridiana, room 314. The transport scheduled for 2300 hours tonight to Bucharest. The 5 women you're holding there. Should I continue? Marco's hand froze halfway to the espresso machine. His mind raced through possibilities. Law enforcement, rival operation, extortion attempt. I don't know what you're talking about. You do. Your handlers rotate shifts at 0600, 1400, and 2200. You use Salvetti Servizi di Pulizia as cover, moving women through legitimate logistics infrastructure. Your coordinator in Turin is Giancarlo Rossi. Your financial transfers route through shell companies in Malta and Cyprus. Your encrypted communications discuss merchandise and delivery schedules using platforms you believe are secure but aren't. The espresso machine hissed in the silence that followed. Marco felt his chest tighten. This wasn't law enforcement. Police would be breaking down his door, not calling. But what concerns me more, the voice continued, is how exposure would affect your daughter Sofia. 21, studying economics at Bologna. Your wife Elena, respiratory therapist at Ospedale San Raffaele. Your mother Lucia at the Sacra Familia care facility. I'm not threatening them, Marco. I'm simply noting how completely your legitimate life would collapse when every corporation you contract with receives documentation of your secondary operation. Marco's legs weakened. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. What do you want? Complete cooperation. By noon today, you will release all 5 women unharmed. You'll provide their documents, phones, personal belongings. You'll bring them to the address I'm about to send you, a church community center in the Navigli district. Representatives from an international aid organization will receive them. You'll stay while the transfer completes, ensuring their safety. And if I refuse? Then by 1300 hours, Interpol receives everything I have. Every corporation you work with, Siemens, Lufthansa, the regional government, receives comprehensive files. Your business collapses. Your family's reputation disintegrates. Your superiors in Turin receive documentation implicating them as well, which means they'll know who provided the evidence. Your daughter learns what her father really does. Your wife understands why her life is destroyed. You'll spend the next decade in prison, while everyone you've ever cared about deals with the aftermath. The voice paused, letting Marco absorb the totality of what he faced. Or you cooperate completely, dissolve your Milan operation within 72 hours, and this conversation never happened. The information remains private. Your legitimate business continues. Your family never knows. You have until 1,000 hours to decide. I'll call back. The line went dead. Marco sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. The caller hadn't threatened violence, hadn't demanded money, had simply presented a choice that was no choice at all. At 10:03 hours, when the phone rang again, Marco answered immediately. I agree to everything. Marco Salvetti's voice was hollow when he called back. No defiance, no negotiation. Just the flat tone of a man who understood he'd been outmaneuvered so completely that resistance was meaningless. I agree to everything. Zarevyn provided instructions with clinical precision. Marco would personally transport all 5 women to Centro Comunitario San Marco in the Navigli district by 1300 hours. He would bring their documents, passports, identification cards, anything confiscated, their phones, their personal belongings. For he would remain while representatives from Associazione Internazionale per I Diritti Umani received them, ensuring the transfer completed without incident. Within 72 hours, he would dissolve his Milan operation entirely and permanently exit the trafficking business. The alternative remained unspoken, but absolute. At 12:55 hours, Zarevyn watched from a cafe across from the community center as Marco's white van pulled up to the curb. Father Giuseppe emerged from the building, a man in his 60s who'd operated a safe house network for domestic violence survivors for 20 years and asked no questions when Luca had contacted him the previous evening. The van's side door slid open. 5 women emerged, blinking in November daylight, like people surfacing from underwater. Their movements were hesitant, uncertain, while carrying the distinctive body language of people who'd been conditioned to believe that sudden freedom was a trap. Terror and confusion were written across every face. Was this real? Was this another test? Would someone drag them back? The last woman stepped down from the van with controlled precision, her athletic jersey and neck brace marking her as the woman who'd slipped a note into a stranger's pocket and gambled everything on 3 seconds of calculated courage. She made it through the community center's entrance. Then her legs failed. She sat down hard on the stone steps, and for the first time in 3 months, she allowed herself to shake. Her hands trembled. Her shoulders convulsed. The rigid control that had kept her alive finally shattered now that survival no longer depended on maintaining the performance. Father Giuseppe knelt beside her, speaking quietly, not touching, giving her space to break. 10 minutes later, a sedan arrived. 2 women emerged, professionals from the aid organization, experienced with trauma, moving with the careful gentleness of people who understood that rescue was just the beginning of a much longer journey. They spoke in low voices to Father Giuseppe, then to the 5 women, explaining what would happen next, where they would go, what support they would receive. Marco stood by his van, watching the transfer with the numb expression of someone whose entire reality had collapsed in 4 hours. When Father Giuseppe approached with documents requiring signatures, releases, statements, contact information, Marco signed everything without reading, and he understood he was being given mercy he hadn't earned, and that compliance was the only thing preventing total destruction. At 13:47 hours, the aid organization's vehicle departed with all 5 women. Marco drove away in the opposite direction, returning to a life that would never be the same. Zarevyn finished his espresso and left payment on the table. 5 lives extracted from a system designed to erase them. No shots fired, no bodies. Just information weaponized with surgical accuracy. He had a flight to catch. Before the aid organization's vehicle departed, Father Giuseppe approached the young woman with quiet discretion. Someone had requested to speak with her, he explained, if she felt ready. No obligation, no pressure, just an offer. She was led to a small office on the community center's 2nd floor. Simple furniture, a religious iconography on the walls, afternoon light filtering through half-closed blinds. Zarevyn waited by the window, still wearing Matteo Rossini's identity like a perfectly tailored suit. For a long moment, they studied each other. The young woman who'd made a desperate gamble in an airport terminal, and the man who'd broken every operational rule he'd built his life around to honor it. She spoke first. "You came." Her voice was raw from hours of suppressed emotion, but steady. "I wasn't certain you would." "You provided excellent intelligence," Zarevyn replied, "and you executed a calculated risk under extreme pressure. That deserved acknowledgement." She sat down carefully, still wearing the cervical collar, her hands folded in her lap with the same controlled precision she'd maintained throughout her captivity. Not the posture of someone seeking comfort, but of someone maintaining operational discipline even now. They talked for 15 minutes. Zarevyn didn't offer sympathy or reassurance. She would receive that from the trauma specialists waiting at the secure facility. Instead, he treated her as what she was, someone who demonstrated strategic thinking under conditions that would have broken most people. "How did you identify me?" he asked. "A crowded terminal, hundreds of travelers. You had seconds to choose." Her answer came without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting to explain the calculation. "The way you moved. Everyone else was reacting to their environment, checking phones, looking for gates, responding to announcements. You were reading it, observing, assessing." She paused. "And your coat. Expensive fabric, perfect tailoring, but no visible branding. Someone with resources who doesn't advertise them. I had 3 seconds to choose, and you were the only person I saw who looked like they could actually do something and might choose to." Zarevyn acknowledged her assessment with the faintest inclination of his head. Strategic thinking under impossible pressure. She'd read him as accurately as he'd read her. Before he left, he told her something he believed she needed to hear. Not comfort, but operational truth. What happens next will be difficult. Recovery isn't simple or linear. But you've already proven you know how to survive by thinking clearly when most people would collapse. That's not a skill that disappears. Don't lose it. She met his eyes directly for the first time, and something shifted in her expression. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. The understanding that she'd been seen not as a victim to be pitied, but as someone who demonstrated competence under conditions most people couldn't imagine. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing what I was trying to tell you." "What's your name?" Zarevyn asked. "Elowren Veyra." Zarevyn nodded once, then left the office. Father Giuseppe would handle the rest. The aid organization would provide the support she needed. His part in this was finished. But as he walked back toward his rental car, he carried the memory of that final exchange. Two strategic minds acknowledging each other across a gulf of circumstance, connected for 15 minutes by mutual respect for calculated courage. In the 72 hours following liberation, Zarevyn's network ensured complete follow-through with the same precision they applied to every operation. Marco Salvetti dissolved his Milan operation as instructed, terminated his handler's contracts, and relocated to Taranto in southern Italy. Within a week, he'd secured a legitimate position managing inventory for a shipping warehouse. Honest work, far from the network he'd served. His superiors in Turin investigated the sudden collapse, but Dante had ensured that every digital trail led nowhere. No names, no connections, just an operation that had quietly ceased to exist. The 5 women received comprehensive support through Associazione Internazionale per I Diritti Umani, medical evaluations, legal assistance navigating asylum procedures or repatriation, depending on their circumstances and preferences, more trauma counseling with specialists experienced in trafficking cases, housing in secure facilities, where they could begin the long process of rebuilding identities that had been systematically dismantled. Zarevyn returned to Palermo and resumed his routine as if Milan had never happened. Meetings with associates, review of shipping manifests and financial reports, the carefully maintained architecture of Matteo Rossini's legitimate consulting business, and the shadow empire it concealed. But Luca noticed changes. Subtle, but present. His boss now read quarterly reports from the aid organization, documents that arrived through encrypted channels and were reviewed with the same attention Zarevyn gave to intelligence briefings. He never mentioned them, or never explained why an organization serving trafficking survivors suddenly appeared on his reading list. 6 months after Milan, a substantial anonymous donation reached Associazione Internazionale per I Diritti Umani. The amount doubled their annual operating budget. The documentation presented it as coming from the estate of a deceased Palermo businessman, carefully laundered through legitimate financial channels, untraceable to its actual source. The organization's director issued public thanks to an anonymous benefactor. Zarevyn read the announcement without comment. Among the routine quarterly updates, one detail appeared that Luca noticed his boss spending additional time reviewing. Elowren Veyra had relocated to Geneva, enrolled in university courses at the Graduate Institute, and begun working part-time with the organization as a program coordinator. Her focus, international law and social work, specializing in victim identification and strategic intervention protocols. In Zarevyn's private office in Palermo, secured behind biometric locks and surveillance systems, a safe contained items that held significance beyond their material value. Account ledgers that documented decades of operations, photographs of people who no longer existed in official records, and, filed in a sealed envelope, a small folded note written in neat, controlled handwriting. Hotel Meridiana, room 314, 3 men rotating shifts. Transport scheduled tomorrow evening 11 p.m. 5 women total. Marco Salvetti. I chose you because you see things others don't. Not a trophy. Not sentiment. Just a reminder that sometimes the most strategic decision is the one that breaks your own rules. Zarevyn closed the safe and returned to his desk. Business required his attention. The machinery of his empire never stopped. But the note remained, filed away in darkness, a testament to the afternoon when he discovered that his principles had never been as absolute as he'd believed. 3 years later, Zarevyn attended a conference in Rome, the European Coalition Against Human Trafficking's annual gathering of NGOs, law enforcement, and funding organizations. His presence was under a different identity entirely. Davide Mariani, representing the Fondazione Mediterranea per I diritti umani, a legitimate philanthropic enterprise he maintained as part of his empire's public infrastructure. The foundation funded victim services across Southern Europe, its operations completely legal, its board comprised of respected academics and former government officials who had no knowledge of its actual source of capital. During a break between sessions on cross-border cooperation protocols, Zarevyn reviewed notes at a corner table in the conference center's atrium. Attendees moved through the space with the purposeful efficiency of professionals networking between obligations. I know you. The voice was familiar, despite 3 years of distance. He looked up. Elowren Veyra stood before him, transformed. 23 now, wearing professional attire that spoke of someone who'd built a career, not just survived. Confident posture, direct eye contact, the neck brace and controlled terror replaced with purpose and poise that came from having rebuilt herself from the ground up. You remember me, she said. Not a question. I do. They stepped outside to the terrace overlooking Rome's historic center, away from conference attendees and the surveillance of professional spaces. She told him what she'd built from the ashes of her trauma, a program that trained frontline workers, flight attendants, hotel staff, healthcare providers, to recognize trafficking indicators and respond effectively. She taught them what she'd learned in that Milan airport, that sometimes salvation came from a 3-second gamble and someone paying attention. I've helped 11 women in the past year identify potential allies and make contact, she said. No, 4 of them are free now, because someone like you was willing to see them. Because they made the same calculation I did, finding the right person and taking the risk. Zarevyn listened without interrupting, recognizing in her approach the same strategic thinking that had impressed him 3 years earlier. She hadn't become a victim advocate driven purely by emotion. She'd become an operational strategist who understood how systems worked and how to exploit their vulnerabilities to extract people who'd been trapped. The world needs more people who notice what others miss, Elowren said before returning inside. Thank you for being one of them. He watched her walk back into the conference center, this young woman who demonstrated courage he still respected, by now teaching others the same calculated survival skills that had saved her life. His phone vibrated. Luca, with updates on business requiring his attention in Palermo. The machinery of his empire never stopped, never paused for reflection or sentiment. But as Zarevyn answered, he carried knowledge that had taken him 40 years to fully understand. That power without purpose was merely force, that strategic thinking could serve more than self-interest, and that sometimes the most calculated decision a person could make was choosing to see someone who desperately needed to be seen. He left Rome that evening, returning to Sicily and the shadow empire that defined his existence. But the intersection had mattered. Proof that 3 seconds of attention, followed by 18 hours of precise action, could change trajectories in ways that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Some decisions broke your own rules, and sometimes those were the only decisions worth making.